So this week we're going to look at whether psychology can classify itself as a science. On the specification, it says that A-level psychology is a science. I don't know how you feel about that. Do you think you are studying a science? Do you think psychology is more of a humanities subject? After all, we are in the humanities department, but it's a massive debate in psychology, and one which you'll continue to look at further in year 13. So in order to sort of address the debate, we first need to look at what science is, what makes science a science. So if we were to take the Oxford English Dictionary's definition of science, it says that science is a branch of knowledge conducted using objective principles involving systematized observations and observation of experimental phenomena. Psychology, by definition, is the study of human behaviour rooted in the scientific method. So, is psychology a science? So at this point, it's useful to pause and think, what do you think? Do you think psychology is a science? Do you think it's sort of scientific but not scientific? You might be of a completely opposite opinion that psychology isn't a science, nor should it claim to be. But you need to think about your reasons why. Okay, so pause and reflect and think, why do I think psychology is a science or not a science? What are my preconceived ideas of what science is? So it might be, before you proceed further in the presentation, just to sort of reflect on that. So by now you will be familiar with the scientific method that we use in science through study and research methods and through your core studies work. You should see how science operates. There are slight variations, as we'll go on to see, as to whether the hypothesis or theory comes first. But science is this sort of circular phenomenon that it doesn't stop. It proceeds as it's shown in this diagram. So whether your theory first or hypotheses, you have a hunch, you have an idea, and you need to go about looking at it scientifically. A paradigm, as it says there, is sort of generally accepted idea. It's what's currently accepted. So you could argue that, perhaps evolution's largely accepted by everybody. That's a current idea. Psychology is an interesting one, in that we've probably had more diverse paradigms. Not everybody agrees. So in the 60s, probably a lot of psychological research was based on social psychology, whereas now we've got more of a cognitive biological bias. So that's what it, if you're looking at the term and thinking what it is, that's what it means. So whether it's theory or hypotheses, you will then test your ideas out, using accepted methods. You'll gather your data. It'll be written in a standardised fashion, as it says there, under empirical data, that will allow others to do it. You then interpret your data. So you will analyse it, you'll apply statistics to it. What does it say? Hopefully you can generalise, so you can apply it beyond the experimental situation. And as we've recently discovered, the buck doesn't stop there. You then have to be peer reviewed. So you will have others scrutinise your work to check that it's sort of valid scientific research. And then others will take your theory and build on it. So, Milgram's work was expanded beyond his previous research by others. And the process goes on, and it builds this sort of understanding, it builds this sort of scientific knowledge. So, for the purposes of the exam, what you need to be aware of are the principles of scientific inquiry. So I've listed them there. They're slightly different to what you see in the textbook because the textbook doesn't have what hypothesis writing is. So I've added that in, okay, to my list. The other difference is that I've sort of combined control and standardisation because they're a similar concept, whereas in the textbook they're listed separately. I wouldn't worry too much about this, okay? What you need to do is just understand what the term is, yeah? So you need to understand what hypothesis testing is, what control of variables is, what standardisation is. So as long as you can understand that, you'll be absolutely fine. Okay, so you need to be able to understand what the terms mean. So if I said to you falsification, you need to be able to explain that to me as to what falsification is. And then the other stage is to try and apply it to psychology, to think, does psychology have falsification in it? Okay, so that's the sort of applied bit. For the moment, for the first lesson, I just want you to get used to the terminology. What do these terms mean? So build up a glossary, put it into your own words, and then later in the week I will get you to sort of try and apply these principles more to psychology. So, what do we mean by cause and effect? For something to be deemed as scientific, okay, we need a hypothesis, and in that hypothesis, we need to have a IV and a DV. So we have an IV that can be measured, an IV that can be manipulated, and we then have to look at its effect on the DV, okay? So if we have those things present, then we can study cause and effect. So a lot of the cognitive research, take Grant, take Loftus and Palmer, you could argue that that is scientific because it does have these things present. But a lot of psychological research isn't based on lab experiments. So when you have a field experiment or when you have a quasi-experiment, you've got less control of that IV and you've got lots of other things affecting the DV. Similarly, we don't always have experimental research. We have correlations because we sometimes can't directly manipulate things because it's too unethical or impossible to do. So sometimes we can't meet these features of cause and effect. So this is a tricky one for psychology. Sometimes we meet it, sometimes we don't. Another feature of science is hypothesis testing. Okay, so in science, you know this already. We usually have two hypotheses. Okay, we have our alternative and our null, and our statistical test tells us which one we're keeping. Okay, so we usually have two hypotheses, and we design experiments to sort of and statistical measures to decide, which is the true one. Okay, so along with the design of your hypotheses come your variables. Okay, so hypotheses, it needs to be clear in there what your IV and DV are, and science would argue that in studying that you need a high degree of control. Okay, so that's a problem in psychology. Fine if you've got a lab experiment, even then there's problems. Sometimes we don't have full control of the variables because of things like participant variables. If we're doing a field experiment, sometimes it's trickier to sort of control what's going on in the environment, and that could act as a confounding variable to your study. So sometimes it's tricky to have tight control in psychology. So, linked to my previous point, psychology, for it to be seen as a science, needs to have high control and standardisation. Okay, now usually in lab experiments we have that, but when it comes to field experiments and particularly quasi experiments, we don't have these things. So you have to consider whether psychology can be considered a science on the basis of this. So by control, we mean trying to have full control of everything in our study, okay, making sure nothing's affecting the IV. And that's difficult in psychology because of things like participant variables, okay. And then the other thing that we need in psychology is a standardised procedure. Now, sometimes we can do this fairly easily, okay. We can write a script, we can try and do everything in a way that makes it fair for everybody gets the same experience. But sometimes we have things like experimenter bias, which might make standardisation difficult. Okay, so that's what we mean by those two variables. Another feature of science is that we should have quantifiable data. Okay, so our data should be in numerical form, and the way that data is gathered should be objective. Okay, so it shouldn't be subject to bias. So when we're using things like quantifiable data, when we're using numbers, etc., and we're putting into a sort of stats test, that would make it objective. Okay. The problem is that sometimes the way that we score in psychology isn't objective. There's an element of subjectivity. So if you've got a researcher grade in anything, classic example would be Milgram's study, where he actually was recording what would be nervous behaviour. That would be his interpretation of it. So a big problem in psychology is that we have our own biases, which sometimes means that we're not objective. You could argue that perhaps the same is true of other sciences. We're only human after all. So how do we know that, if we're a chemist or a physicist or biologist, that we are being objective? We've still got our, biases at the end of the day. So sometimes it's difficult for other sciences to meet some of this criteria. Certainly, what helps with quantifiable measures and objectivity is having a clear operationalised hypotheses. Okay, so it's crystal clear what you are doing and what you're manipulating, so that other people can do exactly the same as you. Okay, or if you were recording behaviour, if you're clear what aggressive behaviour is, then it makes it easier for other people to record in the same way and do it in a sort of objective way. Okay, one of our sort of penultimate features is falsification. This is the one that's sometimes a harder one to sort of get your head around. What we mean by falsification is that you can prove that something's true, okay, but it's also allowing the ability to prove it false at the same time. Okay, so it's helped by having a hypothesis that's sort of fully operationalized and quantifiable. Okay, so that other people can come along and replicate your work, etc. Okay, so it helps through having standardized procedures. However, okay, sometimes we don't have falsification in psychology, and a classic example of this would be Freudian theory, which I know you haven't looked at in detail at the minute, but Freudian theory is a really good example of showing how it's difficult to prove something true, but also difficult to argue that it's untrue at the same time. Okay, so falsification is achieved through through the other scientific methods that we've talked about, having a clear hypothesis, having standardized procedures. That helps you to falsify your information. Other people could come along, do your study, and they could see if it's correct or not, because it's allowed for falsification. Karl Popper, who I mentioned earlier, okay, very sort of famous philosopher of science, he believed that in terms of the sort of scientific processes we talked about earlier, he believed that the deductive method was the way that we needed to go about doing science. So he's the one that's sort of saying theory first. And he draws a really useful analogy with swans, okay, and this is something to sort of reflect on. And Popper said, and I've lifted the quote, "No amount of observations of white swans can allow the inference that all swans are white, but the observation of a single black swan is sufficient to refute that conclusion. Okay, so that's a really good example of falsification via the deductive method. So finally, another feature that science should have is replicability or replication, and that means making sure that your study can be picked up by others. Okay, so you have standardized procedures, you are repeating your study, so if somebody come along they could do exactly what you did, so you're writing your study in a way that would allow others to replicate your study. Okay, so having careful procedures. So you could argue that sometimes we do this in psychology. Milgram would be a classic example. His study had been replicated all over the world, and led to sort of similar-ish results. And the reason for that was due to the way that he sort of implemented standardized procedures. However, sometimes we don't get replication in psychology because humans are complex. They have their own sort of agenda, personalities, and so sometimes you might, use the same procedure, but might lead to different results because you've got a different group of people, and that might be influenced by their religion or their social class or their age. So sometimes replicability in psychology is tricky, even if you have got standardized procedures. So what I'm going to ask you to do this week are two things. Okay, I want you to get familiar with what these terms mean. Okay, so you need to have a clear definition. So I've suggested perhaps a mind map for that. As you're doing that mind map, you could actually think about, as I've talked about in this video, where perhaps psychology meets it and doesn't meet it, so that you sort of illustrate in some of these features. Okay, so that's the first task that I'd like you to have a look at. So after you've done activity 1, what I want you to have a look at is activity 2. You're not going to be able to do this until you've become familiar with the terminology. Okay, so I know you've done Sperry, so this should be fairly easy. You've got some underlying knowledge of what Sperry studied. But you might have to read about Freud's little hands. You don't have to do it in detail, okay? I'm not asking you to look at notes, but a sort of skim and scan just to get the broad ideas. And then there's a worksheet to do a compare and contrast of Sperry versus Freud, okay? And what that should do is bring out where features of science is met and where it isn't. Yeah, so it's a good illustration to you as to where we can sometimes see psychology as a science and sometimes we can't see psychology as a science. So we've more or less reached the end of this presentation, and now it's good to sort of ask the question again, after you've done the research and been through the activities. Do you think psychology is a science? What do you think? Okay, does it want to be a science? Okay, science isn't necessarily the be-all and end-all. Sometimes we, by taking too much of a scientific stance, sometimes neglect the sort of deeper meanings of perhaps what being human is all about. And what this all prepares you for is a debate, okay? There's, which you might have looked at already through course studies. One of the debates in psychology is whether or not psychology is a science, okay? And you'll continue to look at this debate into year 13. So you really need to understand these features in order to apply the debate, because you might be given in future a piece of research and you need to consider whether it's scientific or not. So that would be done on the basis of the features that we've looked at. Okay, so understanding the debate is going to be really important so that you can utilise this stuff later in year 13. And science is great. Yes, science teaches us wonderful things. It builds knowledge, okay? But sometimes, as I mentioned on my previous slide, sometimes it can oversimplify stuff in psychology. humans aren't atoms that can be sort of easily studied. Okay, atoms don't come into the lab with personality or stuff that's gone on at home or previous experience. Humans are really complex, and so sometimes when you study them through the scientific method, you overlook this sort of richness and complexity of human behaviour. And so the question is whether psychology does want to be a science after all. So that's the end of the conclusion. That's the end of the presentation. Lots to think about, but use your time wisely to become familiar with the psychology as a science debate.